Hello and welcome to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perridan, historian and deputy director here at the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this morning, Bill?
I'm doing great. Very excited about our special guest today, Seth.
Absolutely. And as Bill alluded to, aside from Bill and I, we have a special guest today, and I will hand this off to Captain Tody to introduce our guest and our topic for today. Bill, take it away.
Well, thank you, Seth. Seth and I are very happy today to have a special guest, retired Admiral Thomas Fargo. Now, I worked for Admiral Fargo twice in my career, once on Navy staff in N-81, and the second time when I was submarine commodore in Hawaii, and he was Commander, United States Pacific Command. So all joint forces in the Pacific, now called Indo-PACOM, but then called PACOM. Here's a picture we're going to show for those of you watching on the video of me and Admiral Fargo when we were both a little younger while we were still both on active duty in Hawaii. Admiral Fargo is a 1970 graduate of Annapolis, so he graduated 9 years before I did. And he is a very distinguished submariner, commanding USS Salt Lake City. Now, if you ever saw the movie Hunt for Red October, in fact, you see a poster of it behind him as he's sitting here today. The Scott Glenn character, who was the commanding officer of USS Dallas, was actually modeled after then Commander Fargo. Now, as a flag officer, Admiral Fargo commanded Submarine Group 7 in Yokosuka, Japan, Commander Task Force 74, Commander Task Force 157 in the Western Pacific, the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf. He commanded the United States Fifth Fleet. And if that wasn't enough, Naval Forces Central Command during 2 years of the Iraqi contingency operation from July 96 to July 98. And then he served, as I said, as the 29th Commander-in-Chief, United States Pacific Fleet from October 1999 to May 2002. Was that right, Admiral? Did I get it wrong? Was it PAC Fleet or PACOM? It was PACOM.
Right. No, you got it right. Actually, historically, I took over SINC-PAC Fleet because It was still the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet then in October of 1999 and stayed there until May of 2002 and then moved up to
PACOM.
SINC-PAC at the time.
Yeah,
and about halfway through my tour, we changed the name to Commander, U.S. Pacific Command, in deference to the President of the United States as the only Commander-in-Chief.
We actually talked about that. Roosevelt tried to get King to take the Commander-in-Chief title away from King, and King refused to do it, being Admiral King, right? So, but Rumsfeld, and we did an episode with Admiral Stavridis, who was, of course, Rumsfeld's deputy when all of that went down, and you lost the Commander-in-Chief title. So we covered that. In addition to Admiral Fargo's many American decorations, in February 2005, he was appointed an honorary officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished naval service, particularly strengthening the Australia-United States alliance whilst Commander in United States Pacific Command. And I say that because we have many listeners of our podcast in Australia, so welcome to them. And Admiral Fargo, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome.
Yes, sir.
Well, it's great to be with you both. And of course, this is a subject near and dear to all our hearts. As I told Bill, I was out at Pearl Harbor on Tuesday and on Fort Island for that matter, and came back and took a lap around the submarine force just to put me in the proper frame of mind for this session today.
Yeah, the best house I will ever live in my entire life was my Fort Island house when I was Commodore, with the Arizona Memorial in my backyard, next to what we lovingly referred to as the John Wayne House, which was the house that John Wayne and Burgess Meredith lived in the movie In Harm's Way, which was right next to mine. And so across the street from that swimming pool where the opening scene of In Harm's Way takes place. And so thank you, sir. Yeah. So Admiral, maybe you could set the stage for the strategic circumstance that existed in the Pacific immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Bill. And of course, as as we all know now, the Japanese were very intent on securing the resources they needed for their war machine as they moved into China and down into Southeast Asia. And of course, those came from what they called the Southern Resources Area, which were down, around Indonesia and in that particular region. And the United States essentially decided that they were going to cut off those resources in an effort to stop the carnage that was happening in Asia. And the Japanese, of course, attacked Pearl Harbor. So those resources are important because they influence kind of the direction and the strategic guidance that King was to provide Nimitz in terms of how this submarine force was to be employed. So that's the start of the war. And of course, after Pearl Harbor, and we all know that history, the only assets that were really available to the Pacific Fleet were Halsey's carriers that were not in Pearl Harbor on that particular day. And of course, the submarine force. And the attack on Pearl Harbor missed the submarine force. It missed the submarine force, the naval shipyard, which was also key to our recovery. And of course, it missed all the oil that was located in Hawaii. So that's kind of the setting. Other strategic decisions influenced the employment of the submarine force. We had made a decision after the start of the war that we would attend to Europe and the Atlantic first. So the resources available to the Pacific commanders were pretty limited. And given that, strategies were put together to employ the submarine force in the early days of World War II.
Mm-hmm. Now, in an earlier episode, I made a mistake of saying that within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral King sent out a message directing unrestricted submarine warfare. The moment I said it in that episode, of course, you can't go back. We never edited it out. I realized I'd made a mistake. It was Admiral Stark. Admiral King wasn't comm inch yet. It was Admiral Stark, and the story goes that he didn't even check with President Roosevelt. Right. He just declared unrestricted submarine warfare. Of course, the Germans had already been in conducting unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, so there was precedent. And the Japanese had a pretty effective and powerful submarine force as well. So there's a lot going on here. And of course, Japan, like Great Britain, is an island nation. To what extent do you think it was important for that to happen so early with the unrestricted submarine warfare against this island nation?
Well, the goal, of course, was to stop this flow of resources up from the Southern Pacific to Japan. And the only way you could reasonably do that was with the submarine force. So it was obviously an appropriate and strategic decision made at the outset, and it unleashed the submarine force to go after the freighter and merchant activity that was very prolific, moving throughout those sea lines of communications. And of course, people think that these submarines were out there attacking combatants, destroyers, cruisers, Japanese aircraft carriers at the start, and that wasn't the case at all. It was very much dealing with this logistics flow. And that's where those submarines were pointed and were challenged to contribute. In fact, you would hear a submariner at that point in time say it's not worth wasting a torpedo on a destroyer escort.
Right.
So that was how we intended to interdict the flow of resources to Japan.
Yep. Seth?
And while that interdiction, that plan was obviously proved to be very fruitful later on in the war, in the beginning of the war, and to go back to what Bill was saying, the unrestricted submarine warfare, that order was given 6 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. 6 hours. So, I mean, that, to your point, Admiral, the United States, we were fully aware of the damage that had been sustained by the fleet at Pearl Harbor, and we knew, we being the upper level leadership of the United States Navy, knew that we had two things to use to strike back at Japan: the carriers and the subs. So, I mean, there's a reason that 6 hours after the attack ended, that the order was issued. But back to my original point, the early part of the war, the subs, while they were being deployed in a proper way, we had some issues, did we not?
Yeah, we had a number of issues, and I just want to make a comment before I get into that. That King was kind of a submariner. I mean, he was actually a surface guy, and then a submariner, and then an aviator. And he was kind of looking for sponsorship, along his career. But he understood the value and the capability and the lethality of the submarine force going in. But we did have problems, and frankly. These were the submarine force was mostly populated by older S-boats that had problems in their own right. I mean, we were losing some of these boats to operational issues. The commanding officers of these submarines were very conservative, and maybe because of these operational issues, they were risk adverse. Their success was making sure they didn't lose their submarine. So as you can imagine, they, in fact, weren't the kind of aggressive commanding officer that was needed to really take the fight to the enemy. So a lot of those commanding officers were replaced. The tactics were, once again, very conservative. I mean, we shot from relatively long distances submerged with torpedoes that weren't very good. And so we didn't hit much during that early period of time. And then, of course, the fact that really stuck in the craw of everybody was the torpedoes, and their exploders didn't function properly. I think one of the statistics I saw that in the early days of the war, and certainly Lockwood, when he was in command of the submarines in the Southwest Pacific, saw this with great clarity. Of the torpedoes we shot, maybe 20% ended up as a hit. I mean, even if it was a good shot, and we were getting reports of torpedoes bouncing off the hulls. I mean, they could hear the acoustic echo of the torpedo bouncing off the hulls of these targets, and it was hugely frustrating for the submarine force. But that's what they were dealing with in the early days of World War II.
Yeah, to illustrate that, Admiral, I have the number here. It was a total of 14,748 torpedoes fired during the course of the war. 14,748. And it's estimated that at least 50% of them, maybe 60 to 65% of them, were duds. So imagine, and a percentage of those, of course, impacted and failed to explode. So imagine the impact, the effectiveness of the submarine force had those torpedoes worked better, like the Japanese torpedoes did from day one. If we were only as good as the Japanese, there would have been substantial difference.
Yeah, I remember in some depth, Lockwood's looking at this thing when he's the commander of the Southwest Pacific, and the torpedoes weren't even running at the right depth. They weren't even
running too deep.
Yeah, that was set. And of course, the exploder problems, and they went through huge debates as to whether they should, deactivate the magnetic portion of the exploder and just make it a contact exploder. Of course, Lockwood was a bulldog going after this particular problem, and he was always, on the hands around the neck of the Bureau of Ordnance, and in fact called conferences in places like Mare Island to get everybody together to try to deal with this problem. And it took a while. I mean, I think, as I remember, it was probably late in 43 when we really had felt we had control of the problem, and the numbers were much better, and we were starting to make a real impact. And
at the end of 43, the beginning of 44, if you look at the tonnage totals, they skyrocket around January, February 44. That's when I wouldn't necessarily say the torpedo problem was fixed, but it was at least on the way to being fixed. And at that point, from then on to the end of the war, I mean, we literally strangled the Japanese economy. As you said earlier, Admiral, being an island nation, And especially from having experience in World War I, watching the German U-boats essentially try to do the same thing to Great Britain. And then again in 1939, 40, 41, we knew how to do this. And by 44, with the correct torpedoes, with the right people in command of the boats, with the right boats, we were able to just slowly strangle their economy. So much so that by the end of the war, our subs were having trouble finding things to sink because they'd sunk almost everything, that floated. I mean, they were sinking sampans with deck guns, for crying out loud.
And the lesson there, though, Seth, is that we sent submariners in harm's way for over 2 years, right?
Yes.
December 41 through early 44, without an effective weapon. They were, as the Admiral said, a lot of them were dying in accidents. And I think everybody knows, every student of World War II knows we lost 52 submarines during the war. But a lot of people don't realize that a third of those boats were lost to either accident or blue on blue.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an incredible number. And so, the conservatism that existed prior to the war made sense because boats were sinking right and left. In fact, Admiral King, I think, was put in charge of 2 different submarine rescue efforts when he was Captain King, prior to the war. And so he had experience with that too. The problem is, as Admiral Nimitz liked to call it, calculated risk analysis needed to change once we were in a shooting war. And he pushed that real hard.
Yeah. And it's funny, the people that kind of bubbled to the top, a lot of them were Naval Academy football players, folks like Slade Cutter and Babe Brown. Maybe they just had a little different risk management calculus having.
Could be, yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Having been on the gridiron and kind of in the crucible, their whole lives already.
Yep.
You look, you talked about the skippers, and we will get into the individual skippers, in different episodes later on. But, even with the faulty torpedoes, and by 1943, the Gato class, 42 really, the Gato class boats, the fleet boats were coming into the fleet. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Gato herself came into the fleet in like January 42. I'd have to look up the date. Don't quote me on that. But regardless, even at that stage with the faulty torpedoes, we had skippers who were willing to press, push the edge. Yeah. Right. And push the edge of sometimes, sanity, really. You think of one guy, I think off the top of my head, of course, Mush Morton, exactly. You read my mind. But even guys like Mush, who were, the uber aggressive, pirates, if you will, even they were running into trouble. I believe it was Morton's second to last patrol, where he went out to the Sea of Japan, and he had a load of faulty torpedoes. And this is Wahoo was sunk in October 43. So this would have been obviously late summer 43 when this happened. And even he, the uber aggressive, the highly successful, the poster boy for the silent service, even he was running into trouble. So, I mean, it was a widespread problem across the entire fleet.
Yeah. I think it's a hugely important point. And I don't think people understand the kind of risk that COs like that took. I mean, we were shooting torpedoes at 1,000 to 1,500 yards away.
When we started doing it right.
And so you're coming in at night on the surface,
Correct.
And the horizon's 17,000 yards away, at a certain height of eye. So these submarines were very, very close in and obviously easily visible to a lookout, or and of course from overhead from an aircraft, much more so. But these folks and some of the exploits, they are so close that when these ships zig, the escorts zig, they're passing 500 yards maybe down the side of the submarine, and the risk of collision, of course, is ever present. I mean, we actually changed the color of the submarines over the course of the war.
The paint.
The paint from black to light gray, because as we went in and looked at it and recognizing that they're going to be on the surface and they're going to be backlit maybe by the moon or something, how do we make them less detectable?
Black creates a bigger silhouette or a more distinctive silhouette. So light gray is a little more subtle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then, again, we haven't hit this point yet in our podcast, but a total of 375 officers and 31 enlisted men lost their lives. And that yielded a fatality rate, not a casualty rate, a fatality rate of 22%. So basically, almost 1 in 4 submariners who went to sea knew that almost 1 in 4 of them were going to lose their lives. And much is made about the daytime strategic bombing over Germany, which should be memorialized as being heroic and critical to our victory in Europe. But it was even worse for our submariners. Mm-hmm. And that's something I don't think people can really get their heads around. And as bad as it was for us, of course, the Germans lost 781 submarines. So, and the Japanese lost 130 to our 52. So life on a submarine was bad everywhere, worse for the Germans. But it was a place you can go to make a huge difference. Only 1.6% of Navy personnel were submariners. And I like to tell the story that there were and are more dentists in the Navy than submarine officers. And yet they sunk 55% of enemy shipping, that 1.6% of American submarine officers. So that's incredible.
To your point about the fatalities, Bill, just let the listeners think on this for a minute. When USS Lexington, CV2, when she's going down at Coral Sea, those guys had a significant amount of time to abandon ship. There's footage of it. There's pictures of it. The lines coming off the side of the
time.
Yeah, they had plenty of time to get these people off of the ship.
They were eating ice cream as they were getting off the ship, right?
Indeed. and not in all cases, but in a lot of cases, when the ships go down, you got time to get out of there, or hopefully, at least you hope you do. When a submarine goes down, there aren't too many wounded submariners who survive a sinking. I mean, when that thing goes down, they all go down.
Yeah, there were a few cases where submarines were attacked on the surface, and guys like Dick O'Kane survived.
Exactly. You think of USS Tang is top of mind. That's the first one, our first one I think about. But I mean, when subs are sunk, more often than not, they're sunk submerged, and nobody's getting out of that thing. Nobody's getting out.
And even when there might have been some chance, I mean, our commanders were very sensitive to not allowing the submarine to be captured, so they scuttled it.
Right.
And the Cromwell story is well known, and the officers went down in the wardroom and started playing solitaire, because you can make sure the submarine went down, and the technology, all that information cannot be captured by the Japanese. I think a point to make right here is how sensitive Lockwood was to this, and Nimitz, of course, but to this loss of submarines, and how to minimize the risk to his troops. He worked very hard during the war to build the advanced submarine bases. To get as far forward as he could. Built one in the Marshalls, for example, later on in Guam, obviously Midway. And he learned a lot of this from his time, obviously, in the Southwest Pacific. But, clearly he wanted to be able to get these submarines repaired and refitted, generally put a submarine tender in one or two in each of these locations so that he had the proper capability. He wanted to clearly minimize the distance to these patrol areas that the submarines were going to be operating in, but also he recognized he needed to give the troops a break. He built what he called recuperation centers that Bill and I know as sanctuaries. So that he could get his crew off the submarine, let them relax a little bit, get a chance to re-energize. Built one of the Marshall Islands at Majuro and kind of the pristine waters there. Obviously, in Pearl Harbor, he took over the Royal Hawaiian, so that when the submarines came back to Pearl Harbor, they went right into the shipyard. The crews left the submarines, went down to the Royal Hawaiian, had 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to refresh,
unwind.
And then, of course, they're going back to their ship. They're going to take a ship that's ready to go, refuel, new torpedoes, and back into action.
Yep.
He wrote. I was going to say Lockwood was a big proponent of rotating a lot of the crew in and out too. You talked about the subtenders, Admiral, and I know there were several. I knew several guys that did that very thing. That would make 2 or 3 patrols, and then it would go into midway for just for conversation's sake, and they were pulled out of that boat. Whatever silver size or whatever, they were pulled off of that boat, and somebody else took their place, and they spent some time on that subtender, and maybe a month or 2 or more later, them and 3 or 4 or 5 other guys were assigned to whatever boat was coming in, so other guys could get off and rotate them. And it was about keeping, Lockwood, to your point, sir, it was about keeping his people fresh. And, an exhausted submariner is more liable to make a mistake that could, potentially cost the lives of everyone aboard as opposed to somebody who was a little more fresh, a little more, I wouldn't necessarily say anxious to get back to sea, but anxious to get back to doing what they were supposed to be doing in the first place.
Yeah, and as Bill and I know well, if you're in the middle of a submarine refit and maintenance period, you're not going to get any sleep on a submarine.
Right.
Period.
So,
I mean,
it was more than R&R. It was a matter of necessity to get them off the boat while the boat was being maintained. Yeah. Yes, sir. You spoke about Admiral Nimitz a while back. So he was your predecessor as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, also a submariner. And in fact, unlike Admiral King, he was a real submarine qualified dolphin wearing submariner. Admiral King went to sub school, but never actually qualified in submarines. How did that thought, how did that impact you when you realized, holy cow, I'm holding the same position as Admiral Chester Nimitz, one of the most noteworthy, famous, probably one of the best admirals in Navy history?
Yeah, almost every day. From the moment that you walk into to Nimitz house, which is the residence at Makalapa, and of course, Nimitz came out, essentially at Christmas to take over the Pacific Fleet. The house that he lived in was the same house that I lived in. They were kind of prefab units at that point in time, built in the Makalapa crater there across from Pearl Harbor. He lived there with his chief of staff and his doctor. We all know that at that point in time, wives were being either removed from Pearl Harbor or certainly couldn't come out to Pearl Harbor, and his wife lived in San Francisco that whole period of time. And the first thing that I read was actually Nimitz's biography by Potter. My predecessor, another submariner, Archie Clemens, had it. When I walked into that house, that was sitting right on the desk.
I can imagine.
Indeed. And you were struck by the kinds of decisions Nimitz had to make. The risk reward trade-offs, because every time he ordered to take another one of these essentially airstrips, these are amphibious assaults, but we're trying to build airstrips every 600 miles to get us closer to the empire. And whether it's Tarawa or Peleliu, he knew that we were going to lose, 3,000 to 5,000 Army and Marine soldiers. These were really tough decisions, and he, once he ordered the operation to take place, it was in the hands of his commanders, like Bruins and Turner and Holland, because there wasn't instantaneous communications. Nobody's up, on a VTC like we are right now. Nimitz gave the order, and then he had to wait until he got a report at his commander's behest, right, as to how that operation had gone. The stories are, you can see it at Nimitz house. he had a horseshoe pit, out on the side of the house. He had nothing to do but go out and maybe throw a few horseshoes as he waited to find out whether the plan had been executed as they'd hoped, and what the opposition's response were, and obviously the ultimate result.
So when you mentioned Nimitz, your mind wanders about what might have happened if certain things had not gone the way they did. One of those things that I always wonder about is Nimitz almost dying in a plane crash, an amphibious plane that landed in San Francisco when he was on his way to one of the first conferences with Admiral King. He survived. A pilot actually died in that plane crash as they were landing in San Francisco Bay. His submarine force Pacific Fleet at the time, Admiral Robert English, did die in another plane crash, which is what caused Admiral Lockwood to be moved from Australia to Hawaii and assume the role of sub-pack. You know, the transition from Admiral English to Admiral Lockwood, are you aware of any real differences that Admiral Lockwood was able to make, having been down in Australia and seeing it first, a lot of these things firsthand before he became sub-pack? Do you think that made a difference?
Well, I mean, you never know, because as you point out, these are hypotheticals.
Right.
But I think having Lockwood forward, where, you know, for that period of time where he was in the fray from day one, right? And he had very up close and personal understanding of the CEOs of those submarines, of those crews. He was down on them a lot, and talks about him sitting down with the wardrooms and talking about tactics and employment and operating areas, so on and so forth. I think that had to inform his view as to how we were going to take this fight to the enemy, and in great measure. And so he wasn't part of kind of the almost peacetime submarine force, and he wasn't in a bureaucratic position. He was in a and we've all seen this. The farther forward you are, the more operational you are, the more you're worried about getting the job done, as opposed to who you're pleasing and what the bureaucratic issues are. So yeah, I think it certainly influenced how he prosecuted the war, how he selected people to be the commanding officers of the ships, and as you pointed out, how he rotated people in and out. And you know, there were lots of folks in desk jobs that said, I want to get into the fight, I want to take a submarine forward. He picked some of those to do that, but not all. And that choice of who was going to lead this effort were hugely important. I can't imagine what would have happened if we'd lost Nimitz. And if you've seen these PBYs, I mean, that's how they moved around. These are what we used to call seaplanes, right? And that's how they moved around the Pacific. And of course, they landed right out here in Pearl Harbor,
off of Ford Island,
and East Lock, right? And of course, the Pan Am planes were essentially at the start. That's what they were flying also. But Nimitz' personality was particularly well suited for this particular effort. Very different than King, as you know. Well, I won't go into all that because I'm sure you have before. But Nimitz was, you know, quiet but very firm, and of course, he understood the kind of leaders like Spruance that were going to serve this nation best at that particular point in time.
You know, you speak about Admiral Lockwood, and you, Admiral, you made the mention of him coming aboard the boats, you know, after going down into the wardroom and drinking coffee and having a cigarette with the officers, with the captain and the XO. And that was something he tried to do. I know he wasn't able to do it every time a boat came into to Pearl Harbor and then later in other locations, but he tried to do it as often as he possibly could, because that's, as you said, to your point, that's where he gleaned the information on how to best get the job done. It wasn't necessarily looking at the books. It certainly wasn't talking to the people in Washington who weren't out there. It was talking to the people that were actually doing the job and getting results. And that informed his decisions on what he wanted to do. And because he listened to his people, he didn't just pay him lip service and go down there and say, okay, what you got? And then, you know, great, and then walk out and not do it. No, he actually listened to his people and then employed as many of those suggestions as he possibly could that he believed were good, that ultimately helped out that not only just those particular skippers or boats or what have you, but the entire submarine force. I mean, so much so that they loved him to death, that the subforce loved Lockwood. They called him Uncle Charlie, for crying out loud. You know, whether to his face or not, I do not know. But but I mean, they
Probably
really
not.
did. Probably not, I would imagine.
Probably not. Well, you know, it's a great leadership lesson here, you know, about how you get things done. And you know, and not only going down to the wardrooms when they're in port, but he rowed a bunch of boats during the war, and you know, he tried to catch a ride to Midway, right, on one of the boats from Pearl Harbor. Of course, he had to ask Nimitz each time, and Nimitz didn't let him do it much. But because and this is a lesson we've all learned in command. You'll learn more in if I was on an amphibious big deck, I'd learn more going down and working out in the gym for an hour than I would up in the conference, right? Same thing. You learn more in lower level engine room talking to the watch at 2 o'clock in the morning as to what the real material condition of your ship is than maybe you do from the maintenance and repair meeting that's held every week. So hugely valuable, great leadership style and technique, and hugely effective.
Admiral, you talked about Admiral King a moment ago, and we covered in a separate episode the fact that Admiral King, his motto with dealing with the press was, don't talk to the press, you know, until you've won, and then you tell them who won, right? And we talk about how that allowed other entities, and you know, we pound on MacArthur a lot, to take credit for things that they actually had nothing to do with, like the victory at Midway. There was one famous incident, though, where King must have said, see, that's why you don't talk to the press. And it had to do with a Kentucky congressman by the name of Andrew J. May. Do you remember this incident?
Yeah, I sure do. Speaking of talking out of school. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And this was go ahead.
You go ahead and tell the story, and then I'll provide some thoughts.
Well, as so often happens with politicians who want to appear that they're in the know with their constituents, this Congressman May did a tour of the Pacific, and when he came back, he was talking to reporters and he bragging about the fact, oh, look how smart I am, look how in tune I am with what's going on in the Pacific. And he tells the reporters, yeah, you know, we've been very lucky with our submarine because the Japanese are setting their depth charges too shallow.
Yeah.
Let that linger for a moment. And an article is actually printed in, I think, the Chicago Sun, if I'm not mistaken. And happily, the Japanese don't read the Chicago Sun or something. I'm not sure what happened. But Admiral Lockwood did talk about, he actually gave a number to the number of Americans died because this one congressman talked to the press. I think he said it was 800 submariners died because of this congressman's loose lips. Has that, in your knowledge, has anything like that ever happened before, since?
Well, I think it's certainly happened since. But I'll give you my take on this thing. You know, there's a good reason the submarine force was called the silent service, right? I mean, you know, one is, of course, their detectability and so on. But you know, the philosophy at the time extended well past King, but it was publish nothing, tell the enemy nothing they can take advantage of, which of course we violated with that particular congressman, and also as you read about the planning and efforts to put these operations together by Nimitz's staff at SINCPAC, they restricted access tremendously, and they limited it to just people that absolutely had a need to know. For example, in most of these amphibious operations, only the commanding officer of the submarine, or maybe just the Wolfpack commander, knew the details of the operation. And that's because they were very concerned that people would be taken captive, prisoners of war, and obviously the Japanese would torture them to reveal whatever they knew, other plans, so on and so forth. So it was a strategy that was baked in. So not only the submarine force, but I think the Pacific Fleet to a large extent. It's still, loose lips sink ships piece. But and of course, in our careers, we carried it on during our period of time doing special operations. That we just said point blank, we don't talk about submarine operations, period. And
to this
frankly,
day,
yeah, to this day, and that served us very well. I mean, subsequent to that, we've had a few situations where information got out. Blind Man's Bluff was probably the one that is most evident. We had to make decisions as to whether we were actually going to prosecute those people or not. But I think it's the pressure to talk on this stuff is huge, especially in the current day and age with all of the opportunities to get information out. But in fact, that strategy served us very well. My guess is that there are folks, after all the information that was released about special forces operations, that if they could put that genie back in the bottle, they would.
Yeah, that's right. Is there a SEAL that doesn't have a book out right now? That's the conventional wisdom these days. Yeah. Seth, you were going to say something?
No, I was just going to say that was it May? What was his first name? Andrew J. May.
Andrew.
Yeah. That was something that reverberated through the submarine service, almost immediately, and that, I mean, let's be real. The Japanese did have spies in the United States. They did, just like the Germans did. And that information did wind up getting its way in some way, shape, or form back to Japan. And it did definitely cost American lives. And I mean, it's important to note that, again, that the silent service was the silent service for a reason. And also to that point, rather, I should say that because of the fact that they were the silent service, nobody really knew until way after the war what the submarines actually did, which was, as I think it was Bill who actually first said it, saying 55% of the shipping that the Japanese lost, for crying out loud. Nobody really knew that because there weren't, you read about Butch O'Hare in the newspapers in the United States during the war. You read about different, Medal of Honor recipients. There's only, to my knowledge, there's only one or two times where a submarine commander is relatively widely known, that being the first wing, Mush Morton. His picture does appear in the newspapers, but he's one of the few.
It was before he was killed. That's right.
It was before he was killed, because there's a picture of him with his son, and he's holding up the T-shirt with the Wahoo flag on it. But regardless of this, he was like one of two or three. And the point is that after the war, you had this force that sank more than half of the Japanese shipping of the war, that took a tremendous loss in personnel, and nobody knew anything about it.
Yeah, despite having 7 Medal of Honor recipients, COs, they were not household names, were they?
No, not even not close. And if you go look, some of the Medal of Honor recipients, and God bless them, But if you read the Medal of Honor citations for the submarine force Medal of Honor recipients, you read that and you're like, no, there's no way that can be real. But it is. I mean, if you look at O'Kane's, and you read the citation, one thing, but if you actually read what O'Kane did to earn that medal, not that he was setting out to earn that medal, but I mean, what he did to warrant the awarding of that medal, it's like you made that stuff up. It's incredible. And it's something that, they made movies after the war. They even made movies during the war. Destination Tokyo is one of my very favorite movies. I love that movie. But, Operation Pacific with John Wayne, and, Run Silent, Run Deep. There's a ton of them.
Which Ed Beach hated, by the way.
Well, no, Run Silent, Run Deep?
He hated the movie, yeah. So, but not only loosely based on his book.
But there's, it's an exciting story of the war, but even today, I think it's a relatively unknown aspect of the Pacific War. It really is, in my opinion, anyway.
And Admiral, as much as I love Hunt for Red October, that canonical movie about the Pacific Submarine Force, I don't think has been made yet. I mean, what other missions, when they weren't shooting torpedoes, they were doing a lot of other kind of missions, weren't they? Yeah. Some that you can't even believe.
Yeah, I think that's not well known either, but that there was a period of time when early in the war where we just didn't have torpedoes. We didn't have enough torpedoes to fully outfit the ships that we wanted to send forward. So we sent them on mining missions, and of course these are hugely dangerous missions. I mean, you don't release mines in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You release mines in the front of harbors and waterways and places like that, where the enemy can come into contact with them. So that means the enemy is there. When you're doing,
and you got to get out of that harbor that you just planted the mines in without getting blown up by one of your own mines. And you had Gene Flucky attacking a train ashore, right?
and of course, some of these lifeguard operations, pilot rescue missions. I mean, these submarines are sitting right off the coast of Truk. I mean, they're
Chichijima rescuing George H.W. Bush, our future president.
And they're a mile or two off, because when that pilot bails out, they need to get them. I think one submarine picked up 22 pilots in one day.
Tang.
Yeah,
it was Tang. It was O'Kane's boat. O'Kane's boat picked up 22 pilots off a truck, and I want to say it was her 4th war patrol. It was a record that's, he made a record of rescued aviators that day, and it's still staying. Obviously, there's not too many subs picking up down aviators, but
before every amphibious operation, they had to reconnoiter the beaches, take pictures of them, put people, go in, stick your bow into the sand and get people ashore that could go in and do this. Or maybe you sat a mile off and put them in a rubber raft and let them go in. But these operations, these were submarines that were doing that because nobody else had the stealth and the ability to operate in those contested environments like that, before the landing or the invasion. The Philippines, an awful lot of the resupply that took place for the guerrillas, the insurgents, the coast watchers, people that were trying to help this war effort, was provided by submarines. I mean, fuel and food. Pretty amazing. And of course, it was also the advent of special forces, right?
Well, that's a perfect segue into another mission that that the submarines provided support for. Well, support and transportation was the Macon raid. It's one of the diversionary, quote unquote, attacks that the United States launched just before or just shortly after the invasion of Guadalcanal. But I mean, that was done by submarine. The sub, I forget which one.
And those were Marine Raiders too, right?
They were second Raider Battalion. Yeah, it was second Carlson's Raiders. But it was, I believe it was the Nautilus. Was it the Nautilus?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that brought all these guys up to Macon Island, and like you said, put them ashore in rubber rafts and all this other stuff. And I mean, that was some of the first special operations in the Pacific War and World War II, and they were done by submarines.
Nautilus of Midway fame. And oh, by the way, so much of what you said, Admiral, I fear is still true today, that we have the potential for running out of torpedoes should we have to go to war again. But we have we're still the only people who can get into contested areas stealthily and hopefully get back out. And in fact, that's much of what submarines are still about in 2022. Hasn't changed in the last 80 years.
No, it hasn't. I remember I was in Oppo 2 as the aide to Admiral Bob Long, who was kind of the head of the submarine force at that point in time. And the lesson of torpedoes from World War II was absolutely inculcated into every submariner from then on about torpedoes. And it was, ain't going to happen on my watch. We're going to have torpedoes at work, and we're going to buy them in quantities that are necessary. Now, do we ever buy them in the quantities we really need to? No. But a tremendous lesson. There's one other subject I'd like to talk before we run out of time here, and that is the manner in which technology was inserted into the submarine force, over this period of time. Because we've talked about torpedoes, and we went from obviously steam-driven torpedoes, the Mark 14, the Mark 23, to the Mark 18, I believe it was, electric torpedo. Because obviously we didn't want the wake. We wanted a torpedo that you couldn't detect, and we had problems with those torpedoes too. But but it was important. The advent of the use of radar was hugely important, and a radar on a periscope, so you could get an accurate range was key. The ability, I think we actually invented the concept of the signal ejector then too, so we could put an invasion device out, that might deflect the torpedo. Those kinds of things were tremendously important, and night periscopes. I mean, we didn't think about this at the start of the war, that we're going to be making these approaches at night, and we need a periscope that is much more functional in that period of time. And that kind of tied into what the submarine continues to do today, but these submarine operational research groups that were, academically led and driven, that looked at it, not only technology, like we're talking about, but also our tactics and operations and how they could be improved in order to fortify the performance of the submarine force. So those were all key aspects of this effort.
Mm. And then when in final analysis, Admiral, the whole notion that Nimitz said, yes, you submariners get out there and starve the nation of Japan, it worked, didn't it?
Yeah, it clearly worked. And everybody knows, and we talk about this today, and you see it on that any effort, any military effort, any war effort is only as good as the logistics that you have. And when you can't fortify and resupply with fuel and people and ammunition, all of the things that were moving back and forth in that first and second island chain in Japan, it absolutely brought them to their knees.
Yes, sir. We talked about the logistic impact on the Battle of Eastern Solomons when WASP was pulled out of the fight because it needed fuel. We didn't get fueled in time before the fight began. So yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I was going to say the fact, just to pile on to your point, Admiral, the fact that, as I said earlier in the recording, that in 1945, that the submarines were basically prowling Japanese waters. I'm talking home island waters, with impunity. They could do whatever they wanted. They could hang near surface off the coast. Obviously they wouldn't want to do that, but they practically could. But that they had literally nothing else to shoot at, nothing else to sink. That they were sinking fishing boats. They were sinking sampans, and
they were going into what the Japanese called the inland sea, right?
Right. Yeah.
And getting sunk by mines doing it, looking for something to sink.
Exactly. And the fact that at the end of the war, this is not, you could argue that it was one reason that the Japanese finally, gave up the ghost, that we were literally starving them out. And we were. That's exactly what happened. At the end of the war, 1945, if you look at the Japanese population, they were beginning to starve. They were beginning to feel the effect hardcore. The military already had felt the effect, but the population was now beginning to feel it in a greater effect every single day that went by, because they weren't able to get any food. They weren't able to get the things that they needed to maintain a daily existence.
To build airplanes, to build ships. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it was because of the subs. The subs were strangling Japan, and it worked. That was what, Admiral Stark ordered on December 7th, 1941, and in September 2nd, 1945, it brought that to fruition. You could actually see, the effect of the submarines.
In fact, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conclusion was the war against shipping was perhaps the most decisive single factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and logistic support of Japanese military naval power. Submarines accounted for the majority of vessel sinkings and the greater part of the reduction in tonnage. That was a joint United States Strategic Bombing Survey, not the submarine force pounding their chest.
Yep. Hey, Bill, Seth, I've got one last thought.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to provide, just to wrap this up. And we talk about the leadership in the Pacific, and you've talked about, Nimitz and Spruance, and obviously we talked a lot about Vice Admiral Lockwood. And of course, there was the amphibious team of Richmond K. Turner and Holland.
Mhm.
And you mentioned this in a previous conversation. I would commend to any of our listeners today, if they have a free moment, 15 minutes driving up 280 towards San Francisco. The Golden Gate National Cemetery is located, I think, about 11 or 12 miles south of San Francisco. You ought to stop and go in and see the location where Nimitz, Spruance, Lockwood, and Turner are all buried together in very modest headstones in that cemetery, and it will clearly give you the sense of the cohesiveness of this leadership team throughout the Pacific in World War II.
Yes, sir. They wanted to be buried together. I'm friends with Spruance's grandson and granddaughter, and we're going to do an episode on Admiral Spruance from his house. So that's going to be very cool.
That'd be great.
Yes, sir.
That would be wonderful. It's been a great pleasure doing this today with both of you, and really I commend you for the whole series, and now you got me excited to go back and watch the rest of these episodes.
Well, thank you, Admiral. We hope you
thank you.
do. And if we said anything that you take issue with, don't be afraid to call us out. There have been
Nobody
plenty of
else is.
people doing that. Plenty of people doing that. So the fact that I'm not a historian, I keep saying that, but sooner or later, I can't use that as an excuse, can I?
All right.
All right, Seth, you're going to outro?
Take care.
Thank
Yes,
you,
sir.
sir. And with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcasts, and give us a rating and review. We certainly would appreciate it. Also, if you want to see the video version of this and any of our other episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Perrin. I want to thank you very much. Admiral, thank you very much for joining us. It was a pleasure and an honor, sir. And Bill.
And great seeing you again, Admiral. Hope to visit with you when I'm in Hawaii next time. Yes, sir.
Come out and see us in Pearl Harbor.
Here we go. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.